Welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and co-host is Chris Lucian. And definitely excited to have a good time and geek out with David Bernstein today. So I'm looking forward to this episode because David is, through his training classes, is the one who showed me the light for XP. And so I first got to try out pair programming and extreme programming, refactoring, and all sorts of various awesome things and design patterns. And so, and we're here to talk about some topics today to have a good discussion. So one of them is why XP hasn't caught on for many. We're going to talk about TDD, mobbing, emergent design, and how writing code can help improve your own thinking and problem solving skills. So, but before we jump into those, David, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hello, and thank you guys for having me on this show again. I'm David Bernstein, and I'm a technical coach, consultant. My company is called To Be Agile. And I've been a software developer for over 30 years professionally, and that's a very scary thing to say. And I love building software and designing software. I love thinking about software in terms of modeling things and understanding things. We'll talk a little bit about that, I hope. Yes, and nice. So it's good to be here.
Nice, yeah, great to have you. And let's jump right in. I mean, I myself love XP, and I've pondered this question myself. Well, why hasn't it caught on? You know, I've often seen that in Twitter and places where people are like, if it's so great, how come everyone's not doing it? You know, so what are your thoughts here, David?
Yeah, boy, and I have pondered that many times myself, and I noticed that there's a lot of different answers, or at least a couple of key answers. What I hear a lot in the industry, in the Agile community is, oh, it's those, diploma mills, those, companies that just want to, give you a certification and take your money. And I used to think that, but I don't actually think that anymore. I think that the reason, and this is probably going to be pretty unpopular, but the reason that XP hasn't caught on, the practices haven't caught on, is not that our managers won't let us or anything, but really that there is some kind of resistance among the developer community itself. And I understand that because, most of us went to school and we were bored to death on what we learned. And we realized that, many CS degrees are 20 or 30 years behind the times. And so we get into industry and we learn stuff that is completely different. So we probably don't really need to go through that again. But one of the things that I've realized working with the Agile community, people like you and many other people in the Agile community, is that we've come up with amazing solutions to many persistent problems. I don't think the rest of the world is aware of this. And if we were, we'd find that software development is not nearly as difficult as we think it is. So I think that I think your audience is aware of this because you are interviewing many of the people that I'm talking about. The people that are on your show are these thought leaders, and their ideas are different than what I see 90% of the community doing. And they're actually getting a lot of traction. So those are the ideas that we want to share. And so thank you guys for doing that in your podcast. This is what I've committed my life to, is helping people understand those practices. You said XP, extreme programming practices. And I think that they really nailed it all the way back in 2001, or even earlier. Many of these ideas come from the Smalltalk community, which was in the 70s, as you remember.
Yeah.
So these ideas have been around for a long time. They just haven't caught on because they're subtle and they're pretty complex. Think about Scrum. Scrum is really about the process, right? Stand-up meetings and, stories and stuff like that. Orders of magnitude simpler, and still people don't get Scrum. A lot of times people abuse Scrum.
Yeah.
So I'm not blaming our community for not really understanding these deep technical practices because they're very deep stuff.
Well, it's interesting too, because, I think you mentioned school, right? And going to school and being bored to death. Another thing was in school is that, no one has to work on something that is 10 years old when they go to school, right? Like, they write a piece of code, it lasts for up to 6 months, and then they throw it away, and it never haunts them again, right? And so you start your first job, and then you maybe get put on some bug fixing, and you're like, oh, I'm fixing somebody else's problems, this will never be me. And then like gradually through your career, then you start working on stuff and causing bugs and saying, oh, that bug, I don't have time to look at that bug because I'm working on new features, but the new guy is going to go and take care of it. And so now you're giving that bug to the person you used to be. Yes. And it's just fascinating that, this like, you don't get the experience in school. And I've recently spoken to educators and said, hey, you need like a running project that's like 10 to 30 years old, and then say, add a feature to this thing, right? Because that more mimics the reality, right? And then compare the difference. An XP code base versus a non-XP code base. Go, don't break it, and how long is it going to take you to come back to me with a new feature?
Yes.
And that's
I like to say that it doesn't matter what methodology you use if your code is under 10,000 lines. You can do it all out of your head. I used to be able to easily do much more than that. Now that I'm older, it's a lot harder. But where XP really comes and shines is when we're talking about enterprise software that is big, and you can't do that in a semester. So the little toy projects you do in a semester is nothing like what we face in the business world, in our careers. And the problem is that's when XP really shines. That's when we really have to focus on code quality, where testability is a key issue. And those things just don't come up. I love when new hires are in my classes, people who are just out of school, because one of the things I say in my classes is, comments are not as good as people say. A lot of times what comments distort rather than clarify, because we want our code to be expressive and say what it's doing, not have a comment narrate that. Why comments, why we're doing it is good for a comment, but not the what. And so a lot of times new hires laugh at me because they say, oh, my professor drilled into me that every line should be commented. And I'm like, no, that's not a good practice in industry. Yeah. So little things like that, Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as a result, I think there's this gap. I think that there's really a misunderstanding about what software development really is. Now, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of discipline and logic involved in software development, but I find that the very best software developers have another set of skills as well. They're able to think metaphorically, abstractly. They're able to visualize. And all these things are not the logical, analytical part of our brain, but the more holistic part of our brain. And so we have, to grossly misquote neuroanatomy, we have left and right hemispheres in our brain. And generally one side is more logical and the other side is more holistic. And I think software development is the only human activity that involves both parts of the brain. If you're an accountant, you're using a lot of your left brain. If you're a poet, you're using a lot of your right brain. If you're a developer, you're using both. And what happens is we're taught how to use our left brain in software development. That's what computer science is all about. And we need to do that first. But that's not everything. We need to then be able to understand the abstract side. Think of it this way. I think of it in terms of asking two fundamental questions that we subconsciously always ask whenever we're presented with anything new. The two questions are, what's the same about these two things, this thing that I'm seeing? And what's different about these two things? Those are the two questions. And they're both very important. We always ask both of them. One is more the differences, looking at distinctions is more sort of on the logical side. But finding the abstractions is all about finding commonalities, seeing how things are the same. And this is one of the things I love about you, Austin, because I always see you do this. I see you like integrate and see deeper meanings in things. And Chris, I just don't know you well enough to be able to see that. But this is the hallmark of a high intelligence. And it also is the hallmark of great code, because this is the key skill that allows us to discover the right abstractions in our code to build robust code, maintainable code. It's not about making the computer do something only. It's also about building it in a way that's extendable. And that means understanding the problem and reflecting the problem in the domain, in the code itself. That's the fun part too. When you're able to do that, it's like you see another level of the world. It's really kind of cool.
Yeah, it is. And it is really a rewarding experience. We recently were refactoring until it was extensible. And we didn't quite see the big picture abstraction up front, but as we took each step, we got there. And it was a really rewarding experience for our mob to see it and then be like, oh, you wanted to add error handling for another case? Oh, just add to this list and boom, it's done, and you just rearrange current stuff and then it works. And yeah, it's a really rewarding experience. And kind of tying into that experience and going back to the original question is, why hasn't it caught on? I really like this quote from Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird. You never understand a person until you consider things from their point of view, until you climb inside their skin and walk around in it. And I think about back before I was caught on and addicted to XP practices. And I think, so I was in that skin or in those shoes before. And I think why I remember hearing about it. So what's funny is before I took your class, David, I think I was about 10 years into my career, but I had heard of XP and even did it in college, which is really rare. I think my college experience was rare, where I had a class that did some test-driven development, did some pairing, but then I went and did 10 years of software development that ignored all of that. And it was like I had familiarity, but I hadn't yet had that experience that basically showed the benefit, and maybe I hadn't experienced enough problems to understand. I think you've talked about this before, Chris, where people who haven't experienced how terrible software development can be, right? And so I think maybe 10 years of, hey, we're swamped in bugs. Our project started out the first year like heroes, and then year 3 we're the goats, and we can't, it's super hard to add a feature and everything's broken.
Yes.
And then experiencing it in a pair or in a class or something like that, and being like, oh my gosh, whoa, where has this been my whole life? And so for me, it was that experience. And I guess the question is, how do we help people get a shot to have that experience? I guess, like what prevents that from happening?
Yeah. Well, I kind of think I break it out into 3 levels, 3 phases, which I call awareness, understanding, and action or ability.
Yeah.
So I think the way we assimilate new information is, first we have to be aware that it's possible. And I think that a lot of the community is not even aware that there's better ways of doing things. So awareness is the first step. And, being exposed to people who have done it, like the people on your show, like you guys, like me, who have experienced it at the highest levels at companies all over the world, and seen what is intractable problems become manageable. Once you're aware of it, then you also need to experience it. You need to be able to physically do it yourself. Because otherwise, no matter how great the information is, the book or the class or whatever, it's just, oh, that's nice. You can kind of see it, but it doesn't become yours until you actually do it. So got to have hands-on and experience it. And once that happens, then you get a real clear sense of what it's all about. And then you can apply it to your own stuff. And each phase has different learnings involved, different points of focus. But those are the key barriers that I see. And what we're trying to do is get to what I call unconscious competence. We want to get to the point of where we just do the right things because we don't even have to think about it. It's part of our physiology. And it's very hard. I mean, it's important to get there intellectually, but you can't only get there intellectually. You need that additional experience to get there, to actually physically do it.
Yeah, there's, I think in our development, we hire people that are straight out of university, right? And they'll experience TDD and bug-free code bases and practice XP. And then they'll go to another job, and it's like that grass is always greener thing, like, oh, it's gonna be so great at this new place. And then I hear later it's like, oh, one of 2 things happens. Either they come back, they say like, oh, well, it was actually pretty miserable and I had to start convincing people to do things better. But I've also seen some of our junior employees will end up finding something else somewhere else, and then becoming like the expert in something or something along those lines at that new organization. And so it's been a really interesting thing to see that effect. It's hard, it's very easy to have somebody that's worked in a bad environment come into a good environment and really be behind it. But there really is something that like we need to be able to find a way to convince those that have no experience that this is something that they want to be doing, rather than just signing them up for like 2 to 30 years of suffering, right?
Yeah, really. Really. Thank you for reminding me, Chris, because you have created many thought leaders in the process of your work, right? You guys have turned on tons of
like
people.
Well, it's just like, people come and work with us. They intern, we have internships, and then, things just grow, over time, and some people move on, some people stick around. Just like any organization, they'll have turnover. And but I like to follow up with the people that have left and just like find out about their experiences, because and a lot of it ends up either they took a lot of the knowledge that they had with them over to the new organization, or they're in this like weird parallel universe where everything is broken and on fire, and they can't convince anyone that something that they wanted to do is good. And both stories, I try and at least help with some of those discussions, but I just find it really interesting because, like, having a good software environment and onboarding somebody that's new to software development definitely has the challenge of, saying like, hey, this is not quite what it's like at other companies. And so I actually, and what I like, actually, what I've noticed is the best pattern that we can hope for is hire some, new grads that are like right around the same time as somebody who's had experience in suffering through the industry. And then they're like, it's like, oh, well, at my other company, it was like way worse than this. And that story naturally propagates in that environment.
Yes.
But and the worst situation is just like somebody that's new that has like no context of any other place. They just have all these people that work there saying like, it's really great here. Like, we promise it's better than anywhere else. But there's no real solid, like, they don't know it until they experience the alternative.
Yes. And so, like, Austin, you asked like, what's the solution? And I've been thinking a lot about that. And the best I can come up with, I think it's the best solution, is mobbing. Honestly, because when you're in a mob, you can figure stuff out together and you can put it all together. It is the best way that I see people really, really learn. And so, and again, you guys are the ones who are doing this, and Woody, I mean, so I have great faith, and that's where I'm putting my faith, is in mobbing for this.
Well, it's growing as a practice for sure. And I love seeing that. And not only that, but I'm hearing more and more people, talk about mobbing that A, I've never heard of them before, and B, they've never heard of me or Woody before, but they were just doing mobbing and like knew what it was. And so, so that's been a really great experience too.
So cool.
And getting the benefits of TDD and mobbing and emergent design and all that, does feel natural, but you have to have an environment that allows for it too.
Yeah. And I think I'll second one thing, and I'll pass it back to you, David, is that I think with mobbing, it's much more natural. So what were the 3 stages you talked about? It was awareness, and then
understanding and action.
Awareness, understanding, and action. And so I notice when you're not mobbing, it's more difficult to bring someone through those stages, right? For any new idea, innovation, whether it's XP or whatever. But when you're mobbing, you can help people transition through those. So I've been in mobs before where they're like, they don't want to refactor, they don't want to write tests and that kind of thing, right? And so, which is interesting, right? And so you're in a mob and you can immediately build awareness, like, hey, I see we've had a few bugs lately. Would you like to try to prevent that? Would you like to try something testing? Now they're aware of an idea, right? And then maybe we can have a chat about it and they understand it. Maybe they say no and we don't do it now. But eventually you just keep looking for opportunities, and then you can be like, hey, would you like to try it? And then you have an experience together, where someone does not like to extract methods, right? And then so we tried a few together. We answered some objections. We did some performance analysis to show that it didn't destroy the performance of the code by extracting a method. Mm-hmm. And then they start to have that experience, and then they can decide for themselves after those things. And usually after they've experienced it, they usually want to keep doing something like it. Maybe not like how you like to do it, Austin, in your weird way to refactor, but I'm going to go do a different way of refactoring. And so I really like what you said about mobbing, because I think, trying to do that over a Twitter message or a talk or, some other thing it's much more hard to get to experience, So how do you use mobbing to help people realize, the benefits of TDD and emergent design?
So I do it in a couple of ways. you know, you know, Austin, because you've been to my class. I teach classes in XP practices, and they're is really focused on the technical practices, but it's a Scrum developer certification as well for people who want that. And we cover the XP practices, but then we have hands-on. We do at least 12 to 16 hours of hands-on coding, building a full application, not little toy projects, but a whole application together, using all those skills, using emergent design, using design patterns, using all that stuff. So that's how I use it primarily in my classes, is we learn the stuff, but then we go from awareness to understanding by actually doing it. Yeah, and I find it's great. A couple of years ago, I decided I really want to share these ideas in a much bigger way, even bigger than in my book. I wrote a book about 7 years ago called Beyond Legacy Code. And I cover a lot of stuff in it about why these practices are so important. And it's important because for us developers to understand the why, because it helps us use these practices more effectively, but also for our managers and non-technical stakeholders to understand the why, so that they understand the challenges that we developers face and the reason that we want to do these practices. So it's been really well received in the industry, and I'm so happy that it's been helping. But I want to also reach out to the community. So I picked my three favorite thought leaders, my three people who I just think are the coolest people in the world to share my ideas with and work with clients. So it was Llewellyn Falco, Woody Zuhl, and Arlie Belshi.
Nice.
These are my heroes, and I'm just so thrilled that I'm getting to work with them.
Nice.
Awesome.
Yeah, and we're mobbing with clients and stuff, working on their stuff. So that's kind of cool.
Oh, great. So you guys are doing coaching together with clients?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Right on. Fantastic. That's a great group. Yeah. So, so is mobbing part of how you work with clients in that?
Yes.
Or and maybe what's an example of you working with the client to show them emergent design or something like that?
Yeah. Or working on, their legacy code, or in a class, like, when you were in the class, we were pairing.
Right,
people
exactly.
The option of pairing or mobbing. And mobbing is actually, you'd think, if you're not doing it all the time, you'd think that they're really similar. But in my experience, I would love to know what you think. They're really different. The whole experience is quite a bit different. And it's fascinating to see. You're shaking your head, Chris. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, working in a pair, I'm, there's just a lot going on, right? In a pair, you can easily fall into that like instructor and student role, right? Without any dynamic, right? And so it's like, hey, download everything from my brain, or other things, other anti-patterns, like, it's my keyboard now, so you just sit there and watch me type. And like all of the bad habits are just much easier to fall into. Weird power dynamics or just inequity of some kind. But in a mob, there's the opportunities to be a sponsor or a researcher or something along those lines. And so, in my opinion, mobbing, pairing can help code quality and sharing of information, but it doesn't solve the dozens of other problems that come along with working with other people on code, that are very subtle. And as you get better at mobbing and trading through different roles in mobbing, that mob will become more experienced and bounce off of each other well. And I think
that's a good point.
Both retrospectives and learning sessions are better for it too, because you have a greater source of potential feedback vectors, as well.
I also find it's a little harder to get a mob in the flow, whereas a pair, you know what? I'll tell you how I get people into the flow in pairs. It's just Llewellyn's description of strong style pairing, which is, in order for an idea to go from your head into the computer, it must go through someone else's hands. When I say that and they follow that, they, within just a few minutes, go into true collaboration. It's really amazing. But with a mob, it can be a little bit harder because everybody has to participate, and everybody, excuse me, has to get to that level of agreement So some of the techniques I use to get to that point is I set the timer to 1 minute or 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we first write out in English what we want to do, because you can't complete a thought in 2 minutes, right?
Yeah.
You got to pick up the other person's thought. And if you don't, you're just not going to finish anything, right? So you got to get committed to the other person's stuff. But once we do that, we do a couple of rounds of that and we get in sync, and then we can head off very often in the right direction together.
It's also it's also possible that in strong style pairing, everybody knows their roles, right? And so one thing that I see often is, you know, people new to mobbing are like, okay, well, I'm sitting over here. What do I do now? And you know, in a randori, everybody will just watch the person navigate and then offer help whenever encouraged. This is why I like doing the mob programming RPG more, because everybody has an incentive to be doing something and something different at all times. And so if you have 5 people in the mob, you know, you have a driver, a navigator, a researcher, an anthropologist, and a traffic cop, then everybody's looking for all these different little behaviors so that they can kind of notch up experience. And so I think that that's been really beneficial in establishing flow, because everybody has their mind on something and no one feels bored with what's going on. So yeah, I think that that's kind of an interesting observation.
Yeah.
Resources for
So Willem Larson had put together the GitHub on that, and we can put it in the show notes for sure.
Awesome. Oh, great.
Yeah. And actually, the mobbing timer Mobster, developed by Dylan Kearns. So
awesome.
It actually has an option to check off experience points for the RPG. So you can start that timer and it will track your progress through the game digitally. So yeah.
Thank you.
And what I love about hearing people's experiences like yours, David, with mobbing, is that everyone each has kind of wonderfully different ways to help teams get started with mobbing. I mean, I think roles is a great way to get started, because it gives you things to be, it gives you like, oh, well, what do I do? And it's like, oh, you can be a great mobber, you can do all these different roles, researcher. But I also like what you said too, David. And I, someone else who we've had on the show and I used to mob with quite a bit was Chris Stead, and he would do a similar thing to get people like thinking together, which is the goal, right? Is to collaborate and is to make that timer really short. Because I've seen it before in mobs where it basically is like the navigator, whoever the timer says is the navigator, is like reigning, and they're gonna like demolish everyone else's ideas and do their thing. And then when they give up their reign, the next person will take it and then do their, you know what I mean? And, you know, maybe that's how a mob might start to get going. But I really like how you force it to be, hey, instead of me just doing what I want when it's my turn, it's how do we sync our ideas together and then do that, you know? So, yeah. That's great. That's great. So I think this might be a fun topic. So writing code helps improve our thinking and problem solving skills. And I think you throw mobbing or pairing in the mix, because you know, I love both practices. How do these things help improve our thinking, you know, to kind of go more abstract world?
Yeah. And thank you. This is kind of a question that's near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that I'm getting to work with my heroes in the software industry. I'm also getting to work with my heroes in the scientific community. And I'm finding that in science and other areas that they're facing many of the same problems that we have been facing in the software industry for the last 30 years. Complexity is overwhelming every discipline, and they really don't know how to handle it. And we have all these tools now that we've developed to be able to handle it. So like, you know, 30 years ago when I was studying computers and really into it, I was into it because I wanted to do science with it, right? And I would say to, you know, like schools that I was trying to apply for or whatever, like, hey, you know, I have this skill and I could be really useful. And they were like, huh, what? That's not at all interesting, you know? And now I go to scientists and I'm like, you know, have these skills. And they're like, yes, we really need you, help. But it's not just the physical skills, but like you're saying, Austin, the sort of philosophical side of understanding. Because what we're doing in software development is modeling thought. That's our job. See, that was my passion as a kid, is to understand how we think. I wanted to be a scientist, and I just wound up in software, and I thought I'd lost, like I missed my calling. And it was really in the early 2000s when I started to study design patterns. I learned from Al Shalloway and Scott Bain, who I was, by the way, just talking to on the phone. And they kind of showed me this philosophical side. And I realized that software development is really about modeling thought. And doing it well is about modeling thought well. And so, when you come up with a good, resilient design, a design that's elegant, that makes sense, there's reasons for it. And so, I'm reading Domain-Driven Design, which is an amazing book. And he talks a lot about this, like the domain model, and really understanding that domain model and separating out the language of how we implement the domain model, right? Because there's those two things, but keeping them separate is really important. I find that's really important in thinking rigorously as well. Let me give you a quick example. In software, we talk about behaviors. In object-oriented programming, every behavior is owned by an entity, right? That's the idea of an object. An object owns its behaviors.
Yeah.
And so this is how we manage to scale things up, because each object is isolated or should be encapsulated from other things. I find that a lot of times scientists or other people, when they talk, they don't think about when they're talking about a thing or a behavior, they don't think about the entity that owns it. But when you do, everything starts to normalize and we start to understand more deeply, and we can scale our thinking. So developers, I see they do this naturally. And I want to share this with other people because I think it's a really good skill.
Yeah, absolutely. Preventing the explosion of complexity and the thought process to approach that is a long-term skill, I think, for developers. And yeah, in science, I think especially, there's a lot of things that you see where it's like trying to throw technology at complexity and other things that sometimes fall short, that could be useful in this area for sure.
Yeah. And I think, and maybe there's something really cathartic. I've heard you say before, Chris, that lean is cathartic, right? And I think what you're saying too, David, is that good design is cathartic, and at a more meta level, good thought is cathartic, right? And so to give a practical example, we were working with a fairly complicated piece of code, and it was kind of like, everything was kind of in everyone else's business. And then we got it working, and then we started to be like, okay, who owns what? It was asking that question you're talking about. Which entity owns this behavior? And we started to move the methods around and try it out in different areas. And once we found it, you could kind of feel the light bulb, see the light bulbs go off in the room of being like, oh, okay. And so like, there was like almost like a relief of seeing the proper thing own the proper behavior. And then that made the code easy to change, but it also made it easy to think about and understand, and so I think
and we have names for these things. That's called assertiveness.
Yeah.
And when you're able to give these things names and understand them, then the fog lifts and things get super clear. And it's like, oh, this is how we build this.
Yeah.
And that's, like you say, a really good feeling.
Nice.
All right. Well, we're approaching our time box, and so I wanted to ask you, David, if you had anything that you'd like to plug or share.
Thank you so much for asking. Yes, I want to just plug two things.
Yeah.
I mentioned my book, Beyond Legacy Code.
Yep.
I think it's still quite relevant and will be for probably generations, because I'm really talking about the eternal principles of software development.
Yeah, there's a picture of the mob that I was working on in the mob programming page.
You're in this picture, Chris.
Yeah, I'm in that picture. So pretty cool stuff. I feel honored.
Here it is.
Yeah, there we go. There I am, right there in the middle. Keep going.
Yep. Oh, yeah. And the other thing I want to plug is, if you want to really take a deep dive and really master these practices, I have a class on it. It's actually 2 classes, and it's a Scrum Developer certification as well as the Advanced Scrum Developer certification. It's 36 hours. It's in blocks of 4 hours, so it's digestible. So it's over 9 weekdays, 4-hour sections. And we go deep into these XP practices. Just like you, Austin, I actually now have several students who have taken the class and had an ambition of getting much better positions and better jobs and completely transformed their careers. One of my students was just starting out as a developer. She just is out of school, but she just hated her job and she wanted to do XP. So she found an application, but they wanted 5-year experience, hardcore developer. But she's like, she called him up. She says, I just took a class in it. I'm a new hire. I want to be honest with you, but can I come in for an interview? After she aced the interview, she got the job. She's leading a team. It's so awesome. So it happens. It can happen for sure.
All right.
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
I'm teaching these public classes online now, and right now every other month. So right now it's October, so I got one in November 9th, but probably in January and March I'll have another one. And hopefully I'll be doing them monthly soon.
All right.
So go to my website, tobeagile.com, to find out more about it. That's TOBEAGILE, to be agile.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to all our viewers out there, if XP practices are a thing that you think you have a friend that they might want to know more about them, please share this video with them. And please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell and all that. And we will see you next time. So
much for having me. Great seeing you guys.